Good afternoon. Oh, no, what is this? Good evening, everyone. I am so proud and pleased to be introducing one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Marcia Y. Riggs, who, she may not know it, but she is actually my favorite ethicist for how she does what she does. So before I start gushing too much, let me do a more formal introduction. The Vanderbilt Divinity School Howard L. Harrod Lecture was established to honor Harrod, the Oberlin Alumni Professor of Social Ethics and Sociology of Religion, here at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Professor Harrod, who died in 2003, was on our faculty for some 34 years. He wrote widely with several books devoted to ethics and to Native American religions and cultures. The Harrod Lectures, which began in 2004, are intended to deal with aspects within any of the three general fields of Harrod's interests: social ethics, sociology of religion, and Native American religions and cultures. For this year's Harrod Lecture, we are delighted to welcome back to the Divinity School and the Graduate Department of Religion one of our esteemed alumnae, womanist ethicist Dr. Marcia Y. Riggs, who is the J. Erskine Love Professor of Ethics at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. She received her PhD in ethics here and is also one of Harrod's former students. Riggs is often engaged as a lecturer and preacher and has published articles on womanist ethics, moral education, and public policy. She is a recognized authority on the Black women's club movement of the 19th century, the subject of her first book, Awake, Arise, Act, A Womanist Call for Black Liberation. Her other books are Can I Get a Witness? Prophetic Religious Visions of African American Women, an anthology, and Plenty Good Room, Black Women versus Male Power in the Black Church. And she is co-editor of Ethics That Matters, African, Caribbean, and African American Sources. A theological commentary on Ruth and Esther is forthcoming. Dr. Riggs has been awarded a 2017-18 Luce Fellowship from the Association of Theological Schools. This is most notable because this is the last class of Luce scholars. Her research project is entitled Envisioning and Practicing Beloved Community in the 21st Century. She has received the Distinction in Theological Education Award from Yale Divinity School in 2012, the Alumni Achievement Award from Randolph-Macon Women's College in 2006, and a faculty development grant that ran from 2003 to 2004, and a study leave grant from 2004 to 2005 from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning. Dr. Riggs is currently developing and writing a book on an ethical theory and practice called Religious Ethical Mediation. Religious ethical mediation prepares leaders to address religion, conflict, and violence in a transformative manner. She was ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church for 15 years, and then in an early move of reclaiming her time, she received her orders back from that denomination and is currently ordained in the Hillside International Truth Center. Tonight, Dr. Riggs invites us into a dialogue grappling with the question, whose redemption is at stake? Using her religious ethical mediating ethic, Dr. Riggs uses poetry, science fiction, music, and biblical insights to make a case for socially responsive moral agency amid the omnipresence of violence in this 21st century world. Her lecture title, "And God Said What? Creation and Redemption in a World of Global Warming." Please join me in welcoming back a good sister, a fine scholar, and a powerful voice for justice, hope, and truth.
Thank you. It's an amazing thing to return to the place where you received the doctorate. I can only believe that Professor Howard Harrod, now Spirit Harrod, also abides with us in this moment. Such a gentle spirit, and yet a very directive one as a dissertation advisor. So, I also must thank Dr. Towns, because there were a couple of years when I really had to go on a kind of hiatus. And you know, Dr. Towns remained a good womanist colleague. And when I was ready to come back, she brought me back. And so, I thank you tonight. Now, I am old school seeking to be new school. So, therefore, you see this PowerPoint. You see technology. I hope that it will follow me. But if it doesn't, we'll all have patience, right? All right. So let us begin. I'm going to begin by inviting us into a thoughtful, hopefully, ethical reflection and dialogue upon what continues to be the perpetually contentious issue of global warming, especially in the context of the Trump administration's willingness to release and at the same time downplay the findings of the government's National Climate Assessment Report. That report asserts that human activities are the primary driver of recent global temperature rise. Yes, the Earth's atmosphere has been warming throughout history. However, this present warming of the Earth is generally attributed to an increase in the greenhouse effect due to human industry and agriculture. Carbon dioxide, CO2, and other air pollutants are trapping the heat of solar radiation, and the planet is getting hotter. The long-term effects of this current global warming are rising sea levels, flooding, melting polar ice caps and glaciers, fluctuation in temperatures and precipitation, more frequent and stronger El Niños and La Niñas, drought, heat waves, and forest fires. And when we look at, it's coming, this first slide, we see some of that represented graphically and imagistically and in song.
The earth could fly away. Could you see her flying straight through space and time, leaving all humankind behind? If she could fly away, if she could fly away, so far away. If the earth could run away, could you see her gathering all the trees and plants, all the animals, all the birds and fowl, every creeping thing? They have never been her foe, never harmed her blessed soul. If she could run away, if she could run away so far away, then she'd be running for life. Oh, she'd be running for life, running for her blessed life. Oh, she'd be running for life. Oh, she'd be running for life, running for her blessed life. If the earth got up and walk away, could you see her calling for all the oceans and the seas, all the rivers and the streams, all the whales and fish, every reptile that exists? They have never been her foe, never harmed her blessed soul. If she could walk away, if she could walk away so far away, then she'd be running for life. Oh, she'd be running for life, running for her blessed life. Oh, she'd be running for life. Oh, she'd be running for life, running for her blessed life. If the earth could crawl away, could you see her moving on with a body withered down? She'd be struggling to be free, free from cruel humanity. If she could fall away, if she could get away so far away, then she'd be struggling for life. Oh, she'd be struggling for life, struggling for her blessed life. Oh, she'd be running for life. Oh, she'd be running for life, running for her blessed life. Oh, she'd be running,
And if the earth cannot run for her life, Alexis Rockman's portrayal of Manifest Destiny, an apocalyptic vision of the Brooklyn waterfront, depicts future landscapes due to climate change. And this section of the mural in particular projects another future outcome of that infamous 19th century US attitude of entitlement to nature's resources and expansionism of its territories. Likewise, science fiction authors have long, invited us to think about what the world would look like in a time other than our present. And that future that they have projected seems ever more present to us now. So on this next slide, which we could not get to do what it needed to do, so I've got to go out and come back in. Hang in there with me. We're going to look at the trailer to Pumzi, which is an African science fiction film, and Pumzi is the Swahili word for breath, and it's the film writer's envisioning of what it takes to maintain life in the aftermath of global climate change, in the aftermath of 35 years after World War III, the Water War.
Dream detected. Take your dream suppressants. Dream detected. Take your dream suppressants.
Kinetic energy, 0% pollution, 100% self-sustainable.
I found the perfect soil sample and planted the mighty seed. It's growing.
Soil sample.
The one you sent. The box with no delivery note.
I didn't send anything. Reported to security and move on.
This could mean there's life on the outside.
You are not qualified to determine that. Forward your work to the science lab.
I'd like to apply for an exit visa to go outside. If I could find the original soil, I could...
The outside is dead.
But the soil is alive.
Take your dream suppressants.
But I know it's alive. It has to.
You were compromised by your illness. You should have taken your medication.
I have been taking them.
I can't help you anymore.
What about the plan?
Okay, so here's, yeah. Okay. Okay. Wouldn't pop up before. Well, in this film, Asha, the young woman you see in the trailer, is the curator of the Virtual Natural Museum. And she receives an anonymous package that contains a small soil sample. She tests the soil and finds no radiation, and she also finds a high level of moisture. And she then tests the sample with technological instruments, and she uses her own senses. She smells it, she breathes it in, and when she does so, she's plunged into a vision, into that deep pool of water you see. So she believes that life may have returned to the environment outside. Now, in this time frame, you have to go before a council and get an exit visa. And the council consists of 3 women who she goes before and petitions to leave and go out into the world again. She tries to tell them everything she can about why she believes it's alive out there, or the potential for life is there. But they say, nope, it's dead out there, and it's dangerous out there, and we are not giving you an exit visa. So then she says, well, let me show you. She puts her hand on the scanner, and that vision appears. And all that she saw, they can see. But they say to her instead, take your dream suppressants. That's not real. So she's denied the exit visa again. And so now the authorities are called in, and they haul her from the lab, and they then compel her to produce energy on one of the machines. You know, you saw that guy running on the treadmill. He's actually producing energy because this is 100% sustainable environment. And she is compelled to produce some energy and told that this is what she must do as she takes her dream suppressants. So the trailer says to us it requires tremendous exertion of human physical effort and restraint to maintain a society that is 100% self-sustaining with zero pollution. But even more so, it tells us that one's dreams must be suppressed. You must compel one's citizens to remain underground, to escape the dead earth. So there are also economic costs to global warming. In an essay entitled Global Warming, Who Loses and Who Wins, Greg Esterbrook queries, everyone wonders what warming might do to the environment, but what might it do to the global distribution of money and power? So he goes on to assert that add artificially triggered climate change to the already volatile situation initiated by globalization, and the next few decades may see previously unthinkable levels of economic upheaval in which fortunes are won and lost based as much on the physical climate as the business climate. So he goes on to talk more about what that could mean in terms of what the economists say. Well, what we're going to have to do is have adaptive response to this. Accept it. There's going to be global warming. The climate's going to change dramatically. You must adapt. Well, what does that mean? It can mean that the supply and amount of desirable land will be in tremendous flux. So there will be great competition to see who can own the land that is desirable. He also says water. The altering of the ocean currents in unpredictable ways means that there also may be oil under the Arctic waters, precipitating fights over who owns the rights to that. And then, of course, there will be the land grabs for water-related investments, like land for hydropower reservoirs. So he concludes that there must be a long list of adaptations that will take place from humans in the midst of all this, but he says they will all involve producing, buying, and selling. Clearly, the perspective here resonates deeply with the attitudes of economic expediency over and against socially and morally just economic reasons to address problems of common concern for our life and our flourishing. So, of course, we have to say, what then do religious thinkers, theologians, ethicists, people of faith, what do we bring to the discussion? Surely we don't want it to end with economically expedient arguments. So let's listen for some theopoetic insights, and we're going to do it by listening to James Weldon Johnson, which, once again, we're going to just take you to it. And we're actually going to listen to him read his poem, The Creation. Okay, we haven't gotten rid of that one. Okay, what am I doing wrong here? I've X'd it out, but I'm not getting this down. Why is this not coming down? Okay.
Trombones.
Oh, we can't see. Okay, we'll just listen to it. We can hear the audio because it's just pictures of him. Let's just hear that audio.
Read at Columbia University, December 24th, 1935. James Weldon Johnson. And God stepped out on space. And he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And far as the eye of God could see, Darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side and the light stood shining on the other. And God said, "That's good." Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun, and he set that sun a-blazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and stars. Then down between the darkness and the light he hurled the world. And God said, "That's good." Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, the moon was on his left, the stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. Then he stopped and looked and saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world, and he spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes, and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunders rolled, and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed his finger to the sky, and the oak spread out his arms. And the lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. Then God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. Then God raised his arm, and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, "Bring forth, bring forth!" And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, "That's good." Then God walked around, and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things. And God said, "I'm lonely still." Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hands, God thought and thought, till he thought, "I'll make me a man." Up from the bed of the river God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he breathed the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen.
In the creation, James Weldon Johnson's poetic rendering of the biblical account of creation presents us with the interplay of earthly images of nature's abundance and God's abundant creative nature, described as expressions of psycho-spiritual, emotional, human need. Johnson opens the poem, as does a traditional theological doctrine of creation out of nothing. However, unlike the mystery associated with traditional doctrine, in the opening verse, Johnson attributes a very specific psycho-spiritual emotional need to God as motivation for creating the world. And God said, I'm lonely. The following verses of the poem elaborate thus upon the opening verse by continuing to draw for us a picture of God with human needs and qualities and behaviors. In the first half of the poem, God's creative acts are these. God sees the darkness, smiles, and light breaks, reaches out and takes the light and rolls it into the sun and moon and stars. God steps and walks on the earth to create valleys and mountains, spits out the seven seas, bats his eyes, and claps his hands for lightning and thunder, respectively. Smiles again, and the rainbow appears, curled around his shoulder, and raises his arm and waves his hand over the sea and land so that the world can bring forth all species of fishes and fowl and beasts and birds and vegetation. God admires and sanctifies these creative acts by saying, that's good. One interpreter of the poem notes that Johnson's account of creation renders God's physical actions, movements, and psycho-spiritual emotional presence as central to creation. Indeed, there is both God's power in relation to creating and God's intimacy with nature. In the second half of the poem, God stops and looks at the world thus far created and says again, I'm still lonely. Thus God sits down and thinks and finally exclaims, and I'll use his language here, I'll make me a man. So God scoops up clay from the bed of the river and, this time I'll inclusivize it, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay till God shaped it in God's own image. Then into it, God blew the breath of life, and the human being became a living soul. Amen. Amen. Importantly, Johnson understands the creation, nature, and humanity to be the work of God acting divinely yet humanly to make a world that is a response to God's deepest quest for relationship. In response to being lonely. The message is thus surely that we, all of creation, are God's companions and therefore responsible for one another and all of creation because of that relationship to God. Thus, the National Climate Report, scientifically driven assumptions, Easterbrook's economic analysis, and the theopoetic insights of Johnson point us to what I'd like to call a complicity-integrity tension, where we, people of faith, must struggle with global warming from the perspective of the biblical story of creation, because this tension highlights the need to break our complicity with a commercially driven imagination that produces images of ourselves that hinder our ability to recognize one another and the wholeness of our shared predicament amid global warming. We must accept our responsibility to and for one another, all of creation, because we have this moral imperative that is intrinsic to God's creation. If we desire to diminish our complicity in the destruction of creation, then we must recognize that we too are lonely. Furthermore, our complicity derives from our captivity to ideas about abundance that have distorted our self-understanding of human being into that of consumer, and the good life into the acquisition of many things. Redemption, in light of this complicity, integrity tension, must be the reclamation, the reclaiming of the meaning of the good life as abundant life, as life in the Spirit of God, as life in the fullness of being God's creation, God's companions. From Johnson, we are reminded that we are connected to one another and all of creation through a God who said, I'm lonely. the integrity of our humanity as the world warms has equally to do with, one, how we value and respect the intrinsic goodness of God's creation, natural and human. Two, what we buy as producers and consumers of goods. And three, it has to do with advocacy for just labor and trade practices around the world. So what of ethical reflection in the context of global warming? At the heart of our religio-political life today is something I call an absolutist morality. By that, I mean that we want to look at the way in which absolutism and fundamentalism have become so totally wedded to each other that it is an entity unto itself. One scholar reminds us that we can think about the two terms as separate things, absolutism having to do with moral absolutism, that there are indeed absolute moral norms, like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not lie. That's this author's position. And that we can think about fundamentalism as a mindset that views the world in stark dichotomies and refuses to consider situations outside of those dichotomies. Well, I say if fundamentalism is a mindset regarding dichotomies and absolutism is a position regarding the status of moral norms, then I propose we do use the term absolutist morality to point to fundamentalism wedded to moral absolutism found on both the left and the right in society and the churches. Terms that may be used to describe or characterize this absolutist morality when one is living in it. The terms are rigidity, inflexibility, non-adaptive, non-responsive, non-empathetic moral positions and political practices that target, minoritize, vulnerable social groups, particularly on the basis of race and gender, economic status, sexual identity or orientation, cognitive and physical disabilities. Furthermore, this absolutist morality operative in the U.S. is at the heart of what I say is a distorted understanding of how to be and do as moral community. Ethicist William Spahn says that moral community, and I quote, refers to the network of those to whom we recognize an ethical connection through the demands of justice, the bonds of compassion, and or a sense of obligation. And he suggests that moral community derives from whatever social traditions and images from popular speech that guide then the sense of moral community. Because, as he reminds us, images are not morally neutral. They guide our perceptions and our emotions. And so our debates about global warming must surely be framed about how to be and do as moral community. If, for example, we just look at a couple of images that sort of guide our notions of what it is to be moral community in the U.S., two prominent ones that continue. One is the melting pot that signifies assimilation and colorblindness. And second, there is the image of a mosaic signifying diversity and pluralism as norms. Now, in the current religio-political climate, these images are perceived by their proponents as absolutely oppositional, even mutually exclusive. But I'm going to invite you to think about the images in terms of more helpfully saying that the images point to different practices for being a national moral community. There is an American ideal of national unity on one hand, and those practices usually are associated with assimilation, but there is also an American ideal of national unity where the practices are those of diversity. My contention here is that we need a moral vision and ethical practices of being a nation that facilitates living constructively amid our conflicting interpretations of what an American ideal of national unity should be. I therefore propose that the philosophical theological image of beloved community offers a basis for facilitating living as a national community with conflicting interpretations. I therefore contend that we must envision and practice beloved community as living into the tensions of ever-evolving interspecies, intercultural, multicultural, multi-confessional, and multi-religious realities that are the 21st century. That the necessary way forward to addressing our quarrels over global warming and so many other public policies have to be done in this kind of living into the tensions way of engaging conflicting interpretations of who we are. So why beloved community? Well, beloved community does reside in the public consciousness, at least insofar as those who know of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And when King definitely thought of the movement as a kind of beloved community, that the beloved community that is the civil rights movement was his vision of integrated society, one wherein, in his words, genuine intergroup and interpersonal living are manifest. He understood desegregation to be a matter of changing laws, whereas integration was a matter of changing attitudes, hearts, and laws. For integration to be authentic, King believed that human beings had to recognize their interdependency. In his now frequently quoted words, "We are tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality." So he thought this beloved community being practiced through the civil rights movement, where you had the educated and the illiterate, the affluent and the welfare recipient, white and black people, those who had been separated by rigid social mores and laws became bound together in common cause. Well, these diverse groups truly did inspire a kind of moral vision of beloved community for our national community. However, his understanding of beloved community was, as Bell Hooks says, flawed. And the flaw was not in envisioning that there could be beloved community, but the flaw was, in her words, imagining a beloved community where race could be transcended, forgotten, where no one could see color. This dream has not been realized. From its inception, it has a flaw. The flaw, however, it was not the imagining of beloved community. It was the insistence that such a community could exist only if we erased and forgot racial difference. So I turn to a 21st century kind of vision of beloved and image of beloved community, and I turn to Toni Morrison and her poem, The Dead of September 11th. It reads, "Some have God's words, others have songs of comfort for the bereaved. If I can pluck courage here, I would like to speak directly to the dead, the September dead. Those children of ancestors born in every continent on the planet, Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, born of ancestors who wore kilts, obies, saris, jellies, white straw hats, yarmulkes, goatskin, wooden shoes, feathers, and cloths to cover their hair. But I would not say a word until I could set aside all I know or believe about nations, war, leaders, the governed and ungovernable, all I suspect about armor and entrails. First, I would freshen my tongue, abandon sentences crafted to know evil, wanton or studied, explosive or solidly sinister, whether born of sated appetite or hunger, of vengeance or the simple compulsion to stand up before falling down. I would purge my language of hyperbole, of its eagerness to analyze the levels of wickedness, ranking them, calculating their higher or lower status among others of its kind. Speaking to the broken and the dead is too difficult for a mouthful of blood, too holy an act for impure thoughts, because the dead are free, absolute. They cannot be seduced by blitz. To speak to you, the dead of September, I must not claim false intimacy or summon an overheated heart glazed just in time for a camera. I must be steady and I must be clear, knowing all the time that I have nothing to say, no word stronger than the steel that pressed you into itself, no scripture older or more elegant than the ancient atoms you have become, and I have nothing to give either, except this gesture, this thread thrown between your humanity and mine. I want to hold you in my arms as your soul got shot of its box of flesh, to understand as you have done the wit of eternity, its gift of unhinged release, tearing through the darkness of its knell. Through the words of Morrison, we find this image of beloved community. We find our lives as social groups together, complex and complicated by something as concrete as the particularities and differences that we see in the clothing we wear, or the histories that can be uncovered and shared with one another. The interrelationship of humanity that is beloved community is as intangible as the cosmic connection of the bond of death into eternity that we share, made concrete to us through the pain that we have inflicted upon one another through violence, greed, lack of courage, and fear. Finally, we are being and doing as beloved community when we are both bold and humble, as we confess in the face of mass tragedy that we must abandon sentences crafted to no evil. So what of images and ethical reflection? Well, Mark Johnson in Moral Imagination, Implications of Cognitive Science for Ethics reminds us that moral reasoning is actually a constructive, imaginative activity, that it is based upon the metaphors and the images that we use. And so I think what becomes really important for us at this particular time is to consider, and this is just a song, hopefully, consider this song from India Ari.
There are places in Havana that remind me of Savannah, parts of West Virginia that might as well be Kenya, parts of New York City, parts of Mississippi, parts of Tennessee look like another world to me. Oh, might as well be another country. Might as well be another country when you look around. You live in another country too. To be hungry in LA is just like starving in Bombay. Homeless in Morocco is a shelter in Chicago. Right around the corner, just down the road, right before your eyes, right under your nose. Hey, the ghetto might as well be another country. Might as well be another country. Look around. You live in another country too. says that the ghetto is a place of minority and poverty and overpopulation. We live on this earth together, ain't no separation. When you're looking down from outer space, we're just the human race, and the world is a ghetto. It's in every place, in every country. Mario. It's in every place, in every country. Cry. Do you see your brother when you cry? It's a small world after all. You live in another country too. Jamaica is a ghetto. Japan is a ghetto. America's a ghetto. Slovakia's a ghetto. South Africa's a ghetto. Brazil is a ghetto. Israel is a ghetto.
At this time of religio-political partisanship driven by absolutist morality, we must expose and search for the metaphors, the images that lie beneath and drive the debates about living in a time of global warming. Why? Because the debate is connected to all the many cries of suffering at the crux of our political debates and our failures to be moral community. We have to ask, from what perspective do we see one another and our collective place in this world of global warming? Womanist ethical reflection and the mediating our ethical quandaries. We're in the home stretch, don't worry, folks. Womanist liberation ethical reflection for me derives from that 19th century Black Women's Club movement. It's all about a mediating ethic. It's all about an ethics of living into tensions. And this mediating ethic pushes us to be responsive to seemingly opposing positions so as to interpose and communicate between opposing positions. The moral agent of the mediating ethic is a responsible self, but it is a socio-historic responsible self. And so we ask the question in the way of the socio-historic self that Dr. Anna Julia Cooper asked it when she said, when she makes a statement, only the Black woman can say, when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole race enters with me. That is the socio-historic self. It means that our ethical questions must no longer have to do with a moral anthropology that asks about rationality. The moral anthropology has to ask about relationality. Who are we in relationship to each other? How do I know what it is that I am supposed to be or do, or what is fitting or what is liberating? Only in the encounter with another. And so, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. So, here's my image, my model then, of what happens, what needs to happen. This is the way we have to live in the world. It's a world that recognizes that we live in the context of God's creation, the omnipresence of God's justice, and that has many dimensions. We also, at the same time, live in the omnipresence of violence. And violence is fueled by conflict, energies of conflict. But at the same time, if we are people of faith, we also believe we are held in this world by the Spirit of God, alive and ever arching and growing and evolving and moving along with the energies of conflict that keep going and going and going. But there it is, that spirit. It's still moving. It's still there. It's still encompassing and holding us and inviting us to ultimately live in that space where the ethical can emerge. And so it is a model of liberation ethics that says that liberation ethics is intercultural encounter. That is not a description. It is the whole of what liberation ethics is. In other words, it means that that which is constitutive of the ethical is on the one hand intrinsic to who we have been created to be in relationship with others, overcoming loneliness. And on the other hand, the ethical emerges as we encounter others with whom we seek or find ourselves in relationship. So I can only ever know who I am to be, who are we to be, what am I required to do, what are we required to do. I can only know that when it becomes focused in the intercultural encounter where moral meaning is constructed. Theologically, I say that, this kind of model and interpretation is driven by, obviously, an interpretation of the Imago Dei, which you've heard some of, the ministry of reconciliation, and how we understand the Spirit of God. As standing within the Christian tradition, I tend to go to 2 Corinthians 5:11, which you can read on your own time, where we are given the ministry of reconciliation as gift. And as gift, it is there compelling us by the love of Christ, and that's the language of the text, compelling us to mitigate violence that can accompany intercultural encounter. In that same text, we find that the reconciliation that God effects through Christ is actually recreation, because the language of the text says that God creates us and God reconciles us. Creation and reconciliation meet in Christ. We are socio-historic embodied selves who are Imago Dei, Imago Christi, but we are so because we are reconciled and recreated. We become new creation. In the image of Christ, the image of God, we are then called to the ministry of reconciliation. And the love of Christ, according to the text, is that which urges us on. So when we talk about the Spirit, there are two ways I would suggest you think about that right now. The first has to do with the womanist perspective on Spirit from In Search of Our Mother's Garden and Alice Walker's third part of her definition, where she says, loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the Spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. For me, this third part of Walker's definition is helpfully a designation that of an ethical posture for a religious ethical mediator, as that of loving the Spirit. Because the loving the Spirit happens in the context of creativity, in the context of loving music and dancing, in connection to the cycles of life, when one loves the moon, as an expression of erotic, pleasurable embodiment, when one loves food, loves love and food and roundness, in living into the tensions of conflict, when one loves struggle. It happens because of community, the folk, and self-knowledge as well as self-love, loves herself. And all of that as a matter of moral courage, regardless. Second way I want you to think about the Spirit is the way in which Diana Eck talks about it in Encountering God, and I quote her, "The freedom made so clear in the winged flight of the Holy Spirit forces Christians to think about the mystery and power of the spiritual life among people of every faith, Buddhist and Muslim, Hindu and Jewish. When we use the term Holy Spirit, we mean the active, creative, energetic, mysterious presence of the one we call God. The Spirit does not read the fine print of the prayer book or the creed. The Spirit, though she gave birth to the church, is not the possession of the church, let alone of its early church fathers or its modern theologians. The Pentecost experience reminds us that the Holy Spirit is above all a gift, a fullness, an outpouring. We cannot grasp it. We can only be attentive to it, awake to it, and attest to its presence. End of quote. So that spirit that is running around my model exists in the ways that I have just described. So here we are. If you're living as a religious ethical mediator, you're living in the context of those interacting cultures, of a culture of deception and a culture of moral courage. And as a religious ethical mediator, you're seeking to help people live in that space of the overlap. Because it is in the space of the overlap that dialogue happens, that we discover each other in intercultural encounter. It is where we move beyond sympathy. We move to empathy, to what one intercultural communication specialist says is the intellectual and imaginative participation in the experience of the other from the perspective of the other. So we have to nurture empathy as a virtue and as a value. We have to do it because without it, we will be unable to seek and find authentic relationship with one another. Empathy as a value, as a social good, is critical for living authentically into the tensions of diversity and pluralism. So when we engage one another as religious ethical mediators, moral community actually emerges in that space. You saw that ethical emerge coming out. That's moral community. And I use the term space rather than place because it is in moral community as a place where the understanding of orthodoxy goes unquestioned. It is when moral community is a place that an ideal or tradition is fixated upon and becomes rigidly authoritative. It is when moral community is a place when sacred texts serve as proof texts for exclusivity, where the traditions that have sustained communities in the past are deemed no longer acceptable. In moral community, however, as space, living together is dialogical. It's dialogical, interpretive processing of our diverse reading of texts, the sacred text and the biotext of one another. Moral community as space means that we are living along three particular interrelated continuums of moral life. The ethical, which has to do with complicity, accountability, and responsibility. The theological, which has to do with confession, forgiveness, and proclamation. And the socioeconomic, which has to do with corrective, compensatory, and distributive justice. And these are continuums that if I had learned how to make them move in and out together, you would see that they are always interfacing and that we're always moving along them, back and forth. It is not a completion that one finally reaches on the ethical to become no longer complicit and be completely responsible. That's not possible. What is possible is to recognize that you must ever and always keep asking the question about your complicity. On the theological continuum, we cannot go to proclamation until there has been serious confession. And serious confession means you wait on forgiveness. It will not be immediate. And the socioeconomic says that justice always is corrective, compensatory, and distributive. Unless we can acknowledge that something has gone wrong in the past, that injustice has happened that must be corrected, we actually can't ever move to compensatory and to distributive justice. It's false justice otherwise. So this model that I'm inviting you into of being a religious ethical mediator, of being engaged in intentional processes of living into tensions of ambiguity, complexity, there you go, perplexity, fear, and or ignorance of the other, inviting you to live into the tensions of conflict as opportunities for creative moral responses and agency to emerge. In other words, we all must live creatively into the tensions between rejection and invitation, between exclusivity and inclusivity, so as to participate in the expansion and transformation of what it means to be moral community. So finally, living as beloved community. Envisioning beloved community for the 21st century is about practicing beloved community. Living as beloved community is being and doing moral community wherein we live into the tensions of our conflicting interpretations of an ideal or traditions or metaphors of beloved community, that we live into those tensions as generative processes for living nonviolently and in pursuit of interrelationships of justice. As my model of REM suggests, beloved community is continually being imagined as we practice religious ethical mediation. The meaning of beloved community is socially constructed through intercultural encounters in which we respect the particularity of our differences. We do not transcend them, we respect them, and therefore we recognize the moral relevance of embodiment, the moral relevance of contextuality, of the site of our encounter, the moral relevance of the historicity of our encounter, that our encounter emerges always in relationship to a past, a present, and a future. And it happens when the relativity of our interpretations are engaged dialogically. In this moral community, we, each individual and or group, remains committed to our particular confessions and professions, but without becoming absolutists or universalizing about them. Being and doing as a beloved community in the 21st century means that we must both listen and learn from a diversity and pluralism of voices, that we must honor the intrinsic worth of nature, the planet we call home, or simply, we will not flourish or survive. We are creation, human, animal, plant, land, sea, and the heavens above. We are redemption. We are redeemers in the sense of being the ones who have come and have a moral obligation to one another as the creation. We must understand that creation refers both to physical spaces and physical places and spiritual spaces of encounter, where relationship with the planet Earth and relationship with all beings must be earmarked by processing, acknowledging seemingly diametrically opposing positions, opposing needs, interests, and justice claims, in a way that we interpose and communicate between these differing positions and needs. How are we to live into the tensions of creation and redemption of people of faith in the 21st century? In a word, responsively. And living as religious ethical mediators on a quest for beloved community means that we must live expecting that our encounters with a diversity and pluralism of voices holds more promise than peril. Our intercultural encounters are the source for creative ethical responses that are the making of beloved community, lived out in the overlapping space between the cultures of deception and the culture of moral courage. There is no ideal beloved community. We can only envision and practice beloved community as we open our hearts and our minds to one another. Thank you.
Would you
do what we can do. Yes?
Thank you very much for a wonderfully engaging interdisciplinary perspective of looking at what you're calling oneness moral anthropology. What was really intriguing for me, and I have a confession, Dr. Riggs was on my master's thesis committee when I was a master's student at Candler School of Theology, so it's an honor for you to be here in this space.
Thank you.
What I thought was so profound in your delineation of the moral anthropology, the theological trajectory ends with proclamation. So forgiveness, confession, forgiveness, and proclamation. The interest in dealing in interracial contexts specifically is always to have reconciliation be the goal.
Yeah.
And it's very clear that you intently left that out.
Right.
Could you talk about why this moral anthropology of relationship has nothing to do with reconciliation, but this threefold process that you stated?
Yeah, well, it has to do with reconciliation, but reconciliation is not a telos or an end. Reconciliation is a process. It's a practice. It's ongoing. It evolves.
So it's not finished.
Right. It's never finished. I mean, if we want to get technically theological for the theologians in the room, yes, we know that Christ effected reconciliation on the cross, okay? That's the only end that exists out there. But our living of reconciliation is process. It's not a telos. We can't get to it and it's over. Yes?
Hi, and thank you for coming, and thank you for this. I just wanted to ask you a question. I had recently read a book called The End of Western Civilization. Have you read this? Is that why you're laughing right now?
I've read ones like it.
Ones like it, okay, yeah. So, they mix like philosophy and science fiction all together and like paint a picture of what it'll be like 300 years in the future if we don't respond to global climate change. One of the things I found most interesting was their hypothesis that the Western civilization will fall for two reasons. one, because of our standards of like scientific truth, which I think like this year can complicate this rigid understanding of truth, which is great. But the second thing they assert, which was really weird, is that Western civilization falls because of our diversity and our plurality, and we basically can't get our shit together and do something about climate change. And when that happens, China kind of takes the reins and leads the world to salvation or whatever, which I don't know about all that, but I thought it was really interesting, and I'd really like to ask you, have you thought about this at all? Have you heard this kind of hypothesis at all?
Exactly. I'm actually responding to those kinds of assertions because in the first place, it's not that scientific truth is ultimate truth. It is one among many truths. And so my position is saying, let's remember, there are many truths, And the second thing about pluralism and diversity is, it is real. It is actually creative energy, even when it's most conflictual. It is giving us an opportunity to expand our wisdom about how to be together. And so my model is precisely not pushing on an either-or in scenario, but saying we have to learn how to live into the process of acknowledging these differing interpretations, because that's really what we're dealing with, is differing interpretations of who we are, what the world is, and how we shall flourish in it. So the challenge is to actually find ways to mediate those conflicting and diverse interpretations. And sometimes we might, through the process, actually create something we haven't ever thought of before. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for really stimulating and talk that I will continue to think about for a while. I have perhaps a small question, invoking Harrod a little bit here. The distinction that you made between place and space. I do a lot of work in Native American religious traditions, and place is a really important critique of Western Christian tendencies to downplay the earth and to downplay place. So where place is where wisdom occurs. But you're using it rhetorically. It sounded to me you're using place as the location of stasis or of orthodoxy or of the thing that we need. So space. So could you just say a little bit more about how space doesn't fall into the trap of delocalizing?
Yeah. Well, actually, that's the work of the Loose Project, you know? So
okay.
I haven't worked all of that out. But, yeah, the beginning point, though, for me was, you know, working with basically religious leaders or religious leaders in training for whom place is, yes, stasis. It is, you know, the way we ground ourselves in rigidity, actually. You know, we say we're grounding ourselves in tradition, but we're grounding ourselves in rigidity. And so space then became the way to ask them to think about, in particular, the spirit. That the spirit is an energy, therefore in space, available to anyone who's willing to connect to it. So if you can live in space, the space of the spirit, in particular with them, then you can begin to walk into this kind of posture, mediating posture that I think is really critical for the way we think ethically, theologically, even as biblical scholars. The commentary I'm working on is a whole womanist hermeneutic of religious ethical mediation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
So,
oh dear, a former dean. Hi,
so
Jim.
I'll be gentle. I really enjoyed this as a development of thoughts I've heard you working towards, and tonight I'm wondering how this this more tense, deliberately tense, beloved community as a way of being people of faith with other people of faith, which I think you're presenting as one, its own reward. It's a better way of living, and two, maybe a way of living and surviving the 21st century. Interfaces with Greg Easterbrook's people, the demon capitalists who are saying, I'm going to make some big money off this global warming stuff. No matter what happens in India, I can make bucks. Just as an ethicist, what do you do about the people who won't come in from the cold?
Yeah, I get that question a lot.
I realize that's not the...
No, but it is. I mean,
concern,
and this is what I will have to...
Fan.
Yeah, but this is what I will really work hard to communicate in the book, you know? Because on the one hand, you know, it sort of comes out of my training as a transformative mediator, in the sense of it's really not about whether or not you accept, you know, transformative mediation as an orientation, for example. What's important is that I live as that anyway. So I'm constantly inviting the Easterbrooks to the table, their interpretations to the table at least, as equally valid as the interpretation that you're hearing over here from a very different perspective. So the challenge is to continue to be that religious ethical mediator who really does help people become less leery of the fact that multiple interpretations can exist. You know, and that if we can really engage each other authentically, we might figure something out. So, yeah, I mean, I know that's not satisfactory at this point, but it is about, you know, can we work the process? I think they've had it. Thank you again. Yes. Okay. Then you can take it home. Yeah. Thank you.